Good afternoon. My name is Andri Sutori. I am from the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape. Welcome to our weekly webinar, where we share with you insights and voices and experiences from the lives of those who are living at the margins of the capitalist economy in Southern Africa in the time of the coronavirus. Today, we're looking at the lives and experiences of a very important category of essential workers, people who work every day to make sure that you and I can stay alive. I'm not talking about health workers, important as those are. I'm talking about the farm workers who leave home every day to work in the fields and in the pack houses and the orchards, often without any masks, gloves, or protective equipment. Often under very difficult working conditions, almost always for very bad pay, to make sure that we have the food that we need to eat. To guide us into this story, we have three very well-informed and exciting guests. Joining us from Stellenbosch is Colette Solomon, Director of the Women on Farms Project. The Women on Farms Project has been working since the mid-1990s to improve the lives of men and women working on and off farms in the Western Cape region. From Polokwane, we have Mo Lebepe, the Executive Director of the Nkuzi Development Association, an association that has been centrally involved in raising questions around farm evictions since the early 2000s, and which has also been raising very important questions around the living and working conditions of migrant workers. Mo, it's very good to have you here. And last but not least, coming to us from Robertson, we're joined by Ryno Filander, President of the Commercial Stevedoring Agricultural and Allied Workers Union, which has been involved in taking on farm worker issues since 2006. As usual, we will give each of our guests some minutes to just through the most important issues that they see in the fields that we want to address now. That'll probably take us to about 1:30, and then we will go to look at questions and comments from our viewers, who will be able to type comments and questions in the comment box on the YouTube screen. We have been having some technical difficulties. We hope that we can sort out Colette's audio and video problems, but we're going to begin with Mo Lebepe. Mo, can you tell us what the most important issues, I mean, most of us are sitting here in the urban areas. What's the daily reality facing the people who get up at dawn, maybe before dawn, to go and work in the fields? What are the challenges and difficulties they face? To what extent has the government's support responses been able to help them address those problems?
Good afternoon, Andres and fellow participants and contributors to this webinar. I think the question that we have asked is of very much important to us as Nkuzi, and I believe with also other land rights activists in the country. The observation from the field is that the coronavirus is affecting the farm dwellers and farm workers in so many different ways, but key observation has been that the farm dwellers and farm workers have been deprived of their family life. Since the advent of the corona, there are some instances where farm workers are locked on farms and they are not able to can see their children who reside in villages, which came as a result of parents having to look for alternative accommodation for their children in order for them to pursue their basic education in different villages and so forth. And since corona has come, parents are not able to can see the children, and the children are not also being able to can visit the parents on farms and so forth. And those who try to go outside the lockdown which is imposed by the farm owner and the employers, they are threatened with eviction and they are no longer allowed to can come back to the farm. And that also impacts on their employment, because once you are not allowed to come back to the farm, it means you will no longer be allowed to work on that farm. And also not forgetting that farm workers especially around Limpopo, because we also have got issues of the foreign, undocumented foreign nationals and so forth. They are not even registered for UIF. Then it means that farm workers and farm dwellers, they are at a loss. Then they are losing income. They are not benefiting in terms of the family life and so forth. And some, especially those who are on chronic medication and the elderly, they do not even have access to medication and transport to can go and collect their regular medication and also get attention of the health practitioners and so forth. And that has been the situation because the transport system in the around the farms, the operators, they don't want to operate with limited number of passengers and so forth. And those who are compelled to go and get medical attention, they have to take from nothing, hire private vehicles to can go and get medication. There's a farm in the Lebepe municipality where the landowner has arranged for a private nurse to come and provide health services, and that is still not affordable or accessible to the farm workers because they cannot afford the private health services and so forth. And there's also the issue of the access to food and hunger. Given that during the corona or the lockdown, children are not allowed to go to school, children on farms are also, being affected. And the impact of corona has been mostly because the children are not able to can go to schools and they are not having access to the feeding schemes which they used to rely on for meals and so forth. Then that alone is also putting a burden onto the parents because they've lost their jobs, they can't buy food, they can't do anything. And on some farms where the landowners have arranged tax shops for the dwellers and the workers, still the food prices are extremely high, which is something which is not bearable for the farm dwellers and the farm workers. And so far for the farming communities that we work with, we haven't seen government coming forth in terms of distribution of food parcels and so forth. And we are still asking ourselves that for the parents who are on the farms and the children are in the villages, will there be a consideration for provision of food parcels to both parents and the children who are off farm? And similarly, given that the government is considering providing food parcels using the SASA guidelines, which are strictly for the South African citizens and so forth, we think that will affect the farming community drastically because we do have the foreign nationals, some are documented, some are not documented, and that alone, it means that there's going to be an equal treatment of people or the victims of the coronavirus if the foreign nationals are not considered and so forth. And the other issue is that some farm workers, you'll find that without even a prior warning and so forth, they work for the whole month, and at the end of the month, they're given only 30% of their wages. And they are told not to come back. There's no prior conversation, nothing, and there's no severance payments which are made and so forth, and nothing is really benefiting the farm workers and farm dwellers, and there's no relief so far which we've seen coming forth for them. And in such a way, we think the government should, in a way, review the way it is dealing with the coronavirus and responding, especially for the people or the farm worker and farm dweller communities. I thank you.
Thank you, Mo. It is indeed one of the things that's really striking here is how so many of the things that already made life very difficult for farm workers before the coronavirus crisis seem to be exacerbated and worsened by the crisis restrictions on mobility, vulnerability of employment, and this ironic situation where the farms where people are working to produce food become sites of hunger for the people who are working there. From Limpopo, we now turn to the Western Cape. Ryno, I'd like you to answer the same question I asked Mo. What are the realities of your members, people who get up early in the morning, They go to work. You can't zoom into the orchard. You have to be there in person. What are the realities that they experience in trying to make sure that you and I can eat?
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, listeners. Yeah, for farm worker myself, um, one of the most common issues that we struggle with is that farm owners are not giving masks to workers. The health and safety issues that the COVID-19 regulations brought in place certain um, measures that must be taken. The farm owners are not complying with that measures. One of the things is they don't give workers face masks, sanitizers, and um, gloves. Um, so it's a daily struggle for farm workers. CSAAWU has engaged with some of these farms, and on some of these farms, they now give workers face masks at least. But one of the most important things is on the farms right now is even with the UIF fund that the government has put in place there, I don't really think that that would benefit the farm workers because now you can see what happening is um, some of the farms they even give workers a 200 rand for the fortnight and say that the UIF fund has not released the money yet, so workers has to survive on that. The other issues is for CSAAWU is and where the government made a big mistake in the past even you can see when they introduced the minimum wage. So they shouldn't have introduced the minimum wage. They should have introduced the living wage, because now with the coronavirus, you can yeah before the coronavirus, farm workers was seen as vulnerable workers, but now suddenly farm workers is seen as essential workers. Now, in my mind, if you are essential worker, that means you are important to the country. You are important to feed the whole country. So that now you can see the importance of farm workers themselves. So, and one of the things is that Colette will agree with me is even before the coronavirus, when the minimum wage was introduced, they basically dismissed most of the women workers on the farm. And what's happening now, they're even going further. Now that the coronavirus is there, they're going to dismiss even more women workers. So basically, what I'm saying is that this coronavirus is going to affect poor workers and poor communities the most. Because one other thing I want to share with you, comrades, is that from my understanding, I have been working on the farm for now 10 years, on the currently farm that I work on. So my understanding is they work on a budget, a year-to-year budget. So one of the things is the salary they pay us or workers on the farm is already budgeted for till next year. So now the government introduced the UIF fund, saying that employers must draw money from that UIF fund. But what they did is even before they don't apply to this fund. Um they give workers UIF forms. No, they have to go apply for UIF. Um and but the government said that it's the employer's responsibility to go and apply, and afterwards they can basically claim the money back for the UIF fund. Now, you what I'm saying is that what should have happened? The employers should pay the workers, and then they should claim. So what I've seen is if they work on a budget, it means they have budgeted already for salaries for all expenditures they might have for this year. So they will only feel the effect by next year. So it doesn't make sense to me that there is complaining already about the fact that they are suffering. The only ones who's going to suffer the most is the farm workers themselves, because as I said, some of the farm workers have to live on 200 rand for a fortnight, and the farmers are not going, because maybe their businesses will go bankrupt, but they will not, they won't lose anything. Like the way they live, they will still have money because they have savings. They have saved a lot of money. While farm workers is a different story. After this coronavirus, it's going to be very hard for farm workers to pick up their lives where they left, where it's been left off. So basically, what my urge to the government is, comrades, that they must look into it now. It's very more important that farm workers are getting a living wage, because while farm workers are putting their life at risk every day to feed the whole world, and they are seen now as essential. That's very important that all organizations see that as a must, that we must fight for farm workers for a living wage, and it's very important. So my contribution, comrades, is I will stop there. And even on the labor broker side, comrades, it's bad for the labor brokers. You can see what happened now is even the labor brokers are not providing now work for the labor broker. Labor broker himself are not providing work for the labor broker because they have to comply with the COVID-19 regulations, and instead of doing that, they rather put workers off, saying that they must, because most of these workers don't have UIF, they cannot draw UIF, so most of these workers are sitting hungry at home, and so it's very bad, comrades. It's going to be on farm workers, as in even all around in the country. It's going to be very hard for farm workers to, as I said, to pick up their lives after this coronavirus. While the bosses are, comrades, they're not going to lose anything. And maybe their businesses, but their life is going to go on as normal. But for farm workers, it's going to be a different story. You
Okay.
can imagine, comrades. I just want to add this, because I'm a bit concerned about this lockdown that the government introduced. Because, comrades, you can call a lockdown in other countries. There isn't so much social problems like in South Africa. You sit with over half of the country's people are in poverty. You cannot lock down somebody when they are hungry. What is going to happen? People are going to
Yeah.
go out. They're going to look for food, and that
Yeah.
is the reality. So um, I will stop there, comrades. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryno. I want to pick up a little bit on that issue. Many of the issues that both of you have raised, Mo and Ryno, are the familiar ones that farm workers struggle with: insecurity, vulnerability, restrictions on motion, restrictions on family life, poor wages, the ability of employers to dismiss you very, very easily, lack of protection from government. But how have farm workers been affected specifically by the pandemic? And I'm sort of wondering, how do your members and your clients feel about the situation? The news is full of news about this strange new virus, full of scary stories. There's lots of fake news going around. How do people themselves feel? Are people worried about it? Is it able? Are people able to implement social distancing in the workplace or at home? Is it possible for them to feel safe from the virus? How is the pandemic itself affecting the people who are working in the fields? Mo, I'm going to invite you to begin, and then I'm going to ask Colette to come in after that.
Thank you, Andres, for that question. I think the situation has been that based on the information we get from the farm workers on the ground, the farm workers who are locked down on farms for the sake of them providing cheap labor to the farm owners, they are living in compounds where there's no privacy. because you find that 10 people are sharing a room which could be shared by 5 people. And the issue of social distancing is being compromised a lot, and the living condition there, you talk about the issue of access to water is not also attended to, and hence farm workers and farm dwellers, they have to wash their hands regularly and so forth. And there are some who, in the advent of them being available for the convenience of the employer, they are given time to go to the nearby streams to do their washing over the weekend and so forth. Then you can see that there's no interest for the farm worker and farm dwellers, and social distancing is only existing in theory. In practice, it's not doable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mo. And that's particularly worrying situation for us here in the Western Cape, where we know there's very high rates of tuberculosis and other conditions among farm workers. Colette, it's very good to have you here. Can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe begin with the pandemic-specific issues that's facing the people you're working with, and then also tell us a bit more about the broader issues that you're concerned with as women on farms.
Sure. Thank you, Andres. Can you hear me?
We can.
Sure. I think it's just important to say that farm workers, and especially women farm workers, are an especially vulnerable group because their pre-COVID-19 livelihoods were already precarious and already insecure. So women farm workers, I think, as Ryno also alluded to, have increasingly over the last few years been employed as seasonal workers. And that doesn't mean that they're employed for the entire season. Increasingly, they are employed for a few weeks at a time, a few days at a time. And we've also seen with the, after the introduction of the national minimum wage last January, we've also seen that farmers are reducing the hours that women work. So it's also very insecure because women don't know how many hours in a week or in a month they will work. So even pre-COVID-19, women's livelihoods and employment on farms is very insecure. As Ryno has also said, women don't earn a living wage. And with the national minimum wage, which was set at 20 Rand for most sectors, farm workers are only working for 18 Rand an hour. So their minimum wage is pegged even less than the national minimum wage. Farm workers, as we know, are landless. They've been facing great spate of evictions in the last year or two. Again, exacerbated, we think we've seen spikes, especially in Drakensberg. Evictions are rising partly around as a result or as a backlash to the discussions around land expropriation without compensation and so on, but we've definitely seen tenure insecurity spiking in the last year or so. And then also specifically to talk about migrant women seasonal workers who often come from Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Malawi, and whether they are documented or undocumented, they are increasingly being employed by farmers because they are just more exploitable, even than South African workers, and often having to settle for less than the minimum wage. And given this precarious situation where, because of seasonal employment, women ordinarily also experience seasonal hunger, we then find COVID-19 intersecting with women's precarious livelihoods and really being a massive economic shock to women's lives and to women's livelihoods, and especially seasonal women workers. If this virus, if COVID-19 had hit us in January, which would have been the height of the grape and wine harvesting season, women seasonal workers would have still been in employment because that's the height of the harvest. But the virus coincided with the end of the season. So women finished the season in March. And ordinarily now, they would be applying for UIF until the next season starts. So when we're looking at the impacts, it's just important to contextualize current impact in the context of pre-existing insecurity and precariousness. The main impact that we have seen over the last few weeks from women is around food shortages and growing hunger. Women don't have money to buy food because they've been unable to process and apply for their UIF because the labor centers are closed for some absurd reason. The labor centers are not regarded as an essential service, so women are unable to process their UIF claims and receive the UIF money, which ordinarily they would be living on now during the off-season. Secondly, food parcels, for various reasons, to farm workers have trickled down to farms and informal settlements where farm workers live. So a big frustration for farm women is the fact that they hear all the announcements from the president, from the premier, that there is X million rand set aside for food parcels, an extra number of food parcels will be delivered, but women farm workers are not seeing much of these food parcels, so they don't have access to the food parcels. Thirdly, they are also faced with rising food prices. The Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group in April did a comparison between food prices in March and April, and there's a massive increase of nearly 6%, which translates into nearly 190 rand. People are paying more than they did in March. So there's a massive spike in food prices, and simply there are more mouths to feed. I think Mo mentioned the fact that obviously children are at home now and they're not receiving the school nutrition that they would have been when they were at school. And also there are more unemployed adult members in the household. So workers who would ordinarily be employed as domestic workers or gardeners and so on, they're not employed at the moment. So there are just more mouths to feed. And whenever we talk about food insecurity and food shortages, it's important just to remind ourselves that the burden of care and the burden of food provision falls disproportionately on the shoulders of women, of mothers, carers in the household. And also because of the lockdown, women are unable to access the informal safety nets and social networks from which they would normally procure food, going to another farm or going to another informal settlement because of the restrictions on movement. So even that safety net, that informal safety net, is not in place. And then again, I want to reiterate the issue of migrant women workers. They are falling between the cracks of UIF because they are often not registered by the employer. They are not getting food parcels because very often you require a South African ID number. And they're also facing the added threat of eviction from landlords, where they're living in Wendy houses and shacks in the backyards and so on. So there is a need, a concerted need to do something that's very targeted at all migrant farm workers, documented or undocumented.
Thank you, Colette, for those pictures. One of the things that was coming up for me while I was listening to you was last week when we were listening to the stage 4 regulations, much was made of this notion of the COVID-19 ready workplace. And obviously it's a very important thing. If we're going to ask people to work, we need to make sure that the workplace does not become a site of infection and a site of spread. And the question, in a way, what you're telling us here is that farms are at this stage very far from being COVID-19 ready. And we have a question from one of our listeners. Kies van der Waal has asked about the the living and the transport conditions of farm workers. Farmers transport workers on lorries in cramped and unsafe conditions from informal settlements and villages, informal Bantustans. We've learned from the experience in China and elsewhere that mass transport, crowded conditions is one of the key ways in which this virus spreads. Is this still a problem? What are your concerns? And in a way, I want to guide the discussion in a way towards what is it that needs to be done. Firstly, to make workplaces quote unquote COVID-19 ready. And secondly, what is it that the states need to do to mitigate the vulnerability and the exploitation of workers? I don't know who wants to take this question. Mo, shall we begin with you again?
Thank you, Andres. For me, I think as much as the government is able to can go out in the public to share about the relief measures for COVID-19, they must also prioritize the farm worker and farm dweller community in the relief measures. Then, like I indicated, so far, the farming communities that we work with, they haven't yet received any food parcels and so forth. And for me, it also comes with the need for government also to ensure that the farm dweller and farm worker community are not affected severely by the corona. They need to take time and pull all the resources to effect the proactive sections of the Extension of Security of Tenure Act, that this is the time that they implement on-farm settlement to ensure that the farm worker community, the families, they stay together. And when there's a relief, they benefit, the parents, they know what their children have eaten and so forth, if such a relief is provided and so forth. And for me to deploy the on-farm settlement or the housing programs on farms, it will also attract other services like your health services, your schooling services, because most of the schools in the farming communities, they are up to grade 5, if not grade 7. And for one to further her basic education or his basic education, they have to go outside the farm, and that is already signing an eviction notice that you are no longer welcome on the farm and so forth. Then if they develop settlements on the farm, I think that will also solve a whole lot of problems for the farm dweller community. And also there is a need for consideration for even off-season. The children on farms should be provided with some nutritional programs or schemes that they don't only get access to food when it is school period. Even outside school period, there should be a means by government to provide food for such people. And many a time we find the police also supporting the landowners and the employers in terms of evicting the farm dwellers and also pushing the farm workers off their land, especially when it is month end, they don't want to pay the undocumented foreign nationals. They invite the police, but now we don't see police visibility. Then for me, this is the time for the police and the Department of Labor and Home Affairs to join forces and go to ensure that the farm owners and the employers, they are compliant to the COVID regulations on farm for the benefit of the farm dwellers and farm workers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mo. Colette and Ryno, do you have comments on the COVID-19 readiness and the safety of the people who are doing this work on our farms?
Sure. So just in response to the question that was asked about overcrowding on transport, we're still seeing that happening. Women are sending us photographs of overcrowded tractors and bakkies and so on. So there is definitely no social distance in transportation, but also in the workplace. We've had many women calling about the fact that the basic PPE is not in place, social distancing on citrus farms not in place, and so on. So there are a lot of transgressions already happening around occupational health and safety, and many farmers are certainly not ready. Secondly, I think related to that is that we also are seeing farmers, and Mo was mentioning the issue of tenure security, despite the fact that no evictions are supposed to be happening at the moment. We have had countless cases of farmers verbally threatening eviction, kind of testing the waters to see if the farm dweller knows their rights and so on. And similarly with PPE readiness and COVID-19 readiness, again, farmers are testing the waters. And when we've been able to respond, farmers have then put certain things in place, etc. Another thing that we've also seen regarding sort of COVID-19 and the lockdown, especially for farm dwellers or farm workers living on farms as opposed to in townships and informal settlements, is that farmers have just unilaterally imposed draconian restrictions on the movement of farm workers and farm dwellers living on their farms. So just in the last day or so, we had a case from Hermon where a farmer has literally locked the gates and refused workers to leave the farm, even workers who are living, farm dwellers who are working on other farms and so on. They're not allowed to have visitors, they're not allowed to go to the shop, they are forced to buy food from the shop on the farm. And the farmer is leaving the farm all the time, going to shop in town, having a family and friends moving in and out of the farm. So we also have an overreach, if one can put it so mildly, by farmers who are unilaterally reading too much into the issue of lockdown and imposing their own interpretation and trampling on the rights of farm workers and farm dwellers.
Those are, in a way, one of the interesting things about this whole crisis is how many of the terrible aspects of South Africa's past, from apartheid and influx control to the arbitrary power of farm owners, seem to become part of social reality again. There are many interesting questions coming up from our listeners and viewers. I'm going to stay a little bit with the pandemic issues for now. Chris de Wet has asked a question about how is testing organized for farms. We've heard a lot about health workers going out. We've heard a lot about screening and testing. Have any of you or any of your members seen any of your testing happening? Are people being screened on the farms? Are health workers coming to engage with farm workers? I'm asking this because, in a way, some of what you're describing are quite scary conditions for the spread of the virus itself, where people are being put together and coming from many distant places, thrown together in the back of the truck, thrown together in the hostel, working together in the pack house or in the field, and then going home to their families again. Those are very dangerous conditions for the spread of COVID-19. So to what extent are we seeing a health response to that? Have you seen any testing on the farms?
Thank you, Andres. For the groups that we work with, we haven't seen any testing. Hence, I've indicated that for one group of farm dwellers and farm workers, the only means to access the health services is through the private nurse whom has been organized by the farm owner. Then it means that also the mobile health facilities are not reaching out onto the farming communities. Then we haven't seen any testing happening, and we are yet to see what will happen as the government program rolls out.
Thank you, Mo. Ryno, what is it looking like in the Robertson area? Are we seeing health workers there?
No, and not even once have I seen that they do testing on farms. The only thing that I heard in fabrics or some workplaces, the only testing that happens there is when they found out that somebody has tested positive to COVID-19. That is the only way you heard of testing, but not in any workplace in the Robertson Western Cape area. I have heard of farms being tested for COVID-19. By the way, I want to add on the first about transporting workers on trucks and lorries. If on level 4 regulation, it states clearly that if you go out without a mask, you will be arrested. So for me, if farm workers are found to be
Sorry, colleagues, we seem to have lost Ryno's signal. And we're going to try to reestablish contact with him. But there's a very interesting question in this context that comes from Sam Tilley, who points out in these conditions where there are questions about safety and there's not any testing, in principle, people should be able to refuse to work in unsafe conditions. What is your view? Is there, if your members or your clients are feeling worried about the virus, feeling unsafe, do they have the freedom? Do they feel that they have the right to refuse in order to make sure that they don't get this frightening disease and pass it on to their loved ones?
First of all, just with regard to the screening, we don't know of any farms that have been screening workers. We know of a few packing sheds where screening has taken place, but certainly no testing anywhere. And then coming to the issue of,
Goodness me, we seem to be having lots of technical difficulties. We're going to try to bring Colette back, but let's keep the conversation rolling. There's many important questions that can be asked about working conditions on the farm, but we've got Colette back. Let's see if we can establish audio link with her again.
okay.
Colette, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Otherwise, I think we should continue to keep the conversation going, and let's think a little bit about what can be done to improve matters. Frankfurt Juster has asked has asked a question about farm workers reporting grievances to NGOs and wants to know whether
Yes.
the police and ward councillors in making things better. Clearly, one of the big issues that we have here is that the authority of the state and the rule of law is very often absent from the farms. Can those organs, the police and ward councillors, be a vehicle to make sure that people's rights are respected and that they're safe? I don't know who wants to speak to this. Ryno, do you want to have a try? Or Mo?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think from my experience, the reason behind farm workers and farm dwellers not wanting to report matters to and the ward councillors, the police in particular, you find that many a times the police, they come quickly to arrest farm workers and farm dwellers when the employer is reporting them, even though they are not in the wrong. And for them to trust upon the system, which is always working against them, is a bit of a challenge. And the ward councillors also, some will say, when the farm dweller report a case, they say they don't see a reason for them not to leave the farm because it is the farm owner's land. Then why should they want to insist on residing on someone's land which is not theirs and so forth, and which that emanate from the fact that the police and the ward councillors, most of them, they are not aware of the law and legislation which regulate the farm worker, farm dweller, and employer and the landowner relationships. Thank you.
Hi, Colette, do you want to come in? You were rudely interrupted by our technology.
No problem. I just want to add to what Mo is saying. I think, well, in the Western Cape, which I'm more familiar with, farmers hold a lot of sway and a lot of power in these little rural communities, and certainly with police stations and so on. So farm workers are definitely very loath and skeptical of reporting any transgressions to the police. However, for example, with the situation that we had in Hermon yesterday, we reported it to both the Department of Labor and to the police. And by the end of the day, we had heard that the farmer had now, opened the gates and so on. We weren't quite sure if it was, if the police had intervened and so on. But that is something that we do try to do. But even with evictions, just to add on what Mo is saying, with evictions as well, very often the police are just not aware of the provisions of ESTA, the Tenure Security Act, and so therefore are very often used by farmers to assist in the eviction of farm workers until NGOs or other civil society organizations, trade unions, and so on intervene. So SAPS is not going to be the first port of call for most farm workers and dwellers.
Thank you, Colette. And I see a very interesting news from the Karoo, from Sharon Marco Tesa, who reports that farm workers in Central Karoo are not given personal protective equipment, and that they told, don't worry, this is a virus for Cape Town. Well, that's worrying news, that this kind of fake news and false reassurance is being spread. I don't know whether this is typical of what your members are experiencing elsewhere. We're sort of heading into the last minutes, and I want to take the discussion back towards the big picture. In many ways, what you're seeing here is it's really the simple consequence of the vulnerability of farm workers in the context of a crisis where the social divisions that already exist and the power imbalances that already exist are simply being accentuated. And I think we can't end this discussion without thinking about what are the things that need to change in order to improve that. And quite a few of our commentators and viewers have been raising the issue of a demand that's had a lot of airplay in recent weeks, namely that for universal basic income. The whole notion that we've already seen the rollout of increased social child grant. There's talk of the provision of a COVID social distress, relief of social distress grant. And there are many commentators who are saying, look, this is really, if not now, when this is time for a universal basic income. Of course, there are many questions about practicability, but how do you think this would make a meaningful difference to your members and your clients, the provision of such and how would it change things if such a grant was to be available? Colette, I saw you nodding there, so I'm going to suggest that you start us.
Sure. So I think, Andres, this opportunity, I mean, the COVID-19 presents us with an opportunity to analyze our society, to analyze the economy, and to, when we're thinking about longer-term strategic solutions, it gives us the opportunity to address the underlying precariousness of farm workers' livelihoods and the inequalities that structure their labor on farms. So yes, and I think the tentative steps that have been taken by introducing the 350 Rand grant, it's a first tentative step taken by the government. However, it doesn't go far enough. 350 Rand is really, it's almost meaningless, but I think it should definitely reflect the poverty line. And so we should see that going up to 1,000 Rand and becoming a new normal, not only until October or whatever, but that we use this opportunity to introduce a universal basic income grant. But in addition to that, we also need to address some of the fundamentals. The fact that farm workers do not earn a living wage. What do we as citizens and as consumers feel about the fact that the people who keep us alive, who keep us sustained, do not have enough food themselves for themselves and their children? So we need as a society to lobby for a living wage for farm workers. Also, their precariousness is further exacerbated by their landlessness, the fact that they are prone to be evicted because they own no land. And we need to expedite land expropriation without compensation. And, importantly, we need to expedite redistribution of land, and specifically to women farm workers and women farm dwellers, so that they are also able to just grow food for themselves and their households, in addition to any other incomes and livelihoods that they might generate on farm. So again, we need to take this opportunity and look at how do we redress the inequalities in South Africa. And land access for women is one fundamental way that we can achieve, start addressing some of these fundamental inequalities.
Thank you, Colette. The questions are coming thick and fast, and we've got time for one or two more. Firstly, I want to hear your thoughts about one quite urgent issue, and that is, in a way, firstly, whether you can confirm this issue, and secondly, what is your recommendation and what should be done in a situation where the season is closing, with the Western Cape is a hotspot area, Limpopo also has quite significant infection, and people are being sent back to the provinces where they come, thus posing a significant risk for further infection. At the same time, we don't want people to face unfair restrictions on their mobility. How do you think this situation about where migrant workers go should be handled? Ryno, I'm going to ask you to say a few words, and then I'm going to go to Mo for her thoughts. Ryno? Ryno, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Hi, thank you, Andres. My thought on that is you can see the increase of the COVID-19. It's increasing rapidly, and it's a real concern. Now, if somebody from the Eastern Cape or migrant workers from the Eastern Cape is in the Western Cape, my thought on this is they should stay in the Western Cape. You are because you now exposing. It's like my whole thought about the coronavirus. It's like, Andre, they are putting now these farmers or bosses or capitalists, they are putting profit before people's lives. That is the reality. They don't think about people have the right to live. They think they have the right to make profit no matter what they put ordinary workers or people through. So this is my thought on it. They putting profit before life. And you can see they want to send people home while they know we are in a disaster. It's not like it's normal circumstances now. It's abnormal. So I don't agree with it.
Mo, can you speak to the situation of migrant workers in Limpopo?
Thank you, Andres. I think for me, migrant workers are human beings too, and they've got human rights, and also they should also enjoy the labor rights as constituted in the laws of the country, being the Republic of South Africa. And if the workers in the Republic are to be treated in a way, so the same treatment should be extended to the migrant workers. If workers are expected to be accommodated on the farm, the same thing should apply to the migrant workers. And if ever they are not treated fairly, for me, the full arm of the law should apply. And we've seen on TV some businesses being closed down and the owners being, fined for not complying with the COVID regulations. I think the same thing, especially with the law enforcement officers and the Department of Labor visiting the farms for inspection. I think that should also lead to the prosecution of the landowners and the employers who are not compliant, especially in violation of the rights for the migrant workers.
Thank you. And then lastly, Nkuzi Gomedo wants to know, what can we as consumers of food do to assist to put pressure for conditions to change? Is there, in a way, you've very much been talking about farm workers as the victims of unfair labor relations on the farms. We've seen that the state is not coming to the party. What is the role that people in civil society and just us as consumers, what can we do to help make things better? Do any of you have thoughts on that? Colette?
Sure, Andre. So I think that as consumers with a conscience, there are a number of things that we can do. Within the existing system, we can put pressure on the retailers where we shop, and, for example, get them to use all the unused food, for example, and they've got logistics and all of that, and get those to farm workers. But also, I think we can also put pressure on the retailers and this goes beyond COVID-19 now, but we also need to look at the value chain and to make sure that there is social justice all along the value chain, and retailers who have a lot of economic clout, have a lot of power, and by putting pressure on retailers, supermarkets, and so on, they can actually exert pressure on farmers to comply with labor and tenure rights and so on. But going again further than that, I think that as consumers and as citizens, we need to be asking ourselves about our food system. Do we believe that this food system that we now have, which is largely export-oriented, which is industrialized, where one person owns thousands of hectares, is this a just food system when the workers who produce the food can't afford the food that they are producing? So we need to be asking ourselves longer-term questions about the type of society and the type of agricultural economy that we want to see. And also, as maybe wealthier South Africans, we need to start thinking and really seriously entertaining the possibility of the good that a wealth tax could make. Again, in terms of addressing inequalities, not only that apply to farm workers, but that apply to all working class, poor, and unemployed South Africans in our country. We need to address inequality in South Africa.
Thank you very much, Colette. We're in the last minute of our webinar today. Mo, and do you have any last thoughts about the situation that you want to share us with, particularly what do we need to take from this going forward into the future?
I think one last final thought, it will be that instead of us continuing to buy produce from those farmers whom we know that they are exploiting the labor of farm workers, it's better for us to also consider buying locally. Locally is in terms of, we do have small producers in our respective villages and communities. Then I think this is the time that we need to buy from them, because we know how they are producing the food, and we know that the very same way that those people are producing, and the income that they earn is going to benefit the very same community. Then it's better for us to try to support those whom we know that the production of food is not causing any harm to the other person and so forth.
Thank you very much, and for sharing with us about this urgent issue. You've given us many things to worry and food for thought. And we hope to stay in touch with you and maybe have you back. Time to say goodbye for joining us for this hour. We will be back again this time next week, where we're going to step back from livelihoods and questions of the production of food and how people survive, and look at the broader questions of what's happening to democracy in the time of the coronavirus, and specifically the extent to which people are treated as citizens or subjects or even objects of biomedical interventions, and the space for a democratic politics of life in our townships and informal settlements and rural areas in the time of the coronavirus. But thank you very much for this discussion. It's been very sobering. You've given us lots to think of, and look forward to meeting you all again this time next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.